He used to sign contracts that reshaped skylines. Now his hand trembled when he reached into a stranger's cup under a bridge. Rain stitched the city in silver threads that evening, and Olavo Nogueira sat with his back against a concrete pillar, the collar of his coat turned up against the cold. The coat had once been Italian wool, the kind he'd bought for boardroom appearances. Tonight, it looked like any other rag, soaked and clinging. In his palm, wrapped in an old receipt, was a small piece of plastic that had become a talisman, a pen drive, its casing scratched, its tiny light hidden by grime. Inside it, he told himself, was the last line between him and a life that still felt like a photograph he couldn't touch. From the highway above came the dull roar of cars, the sound of a world moving on. Behind him, across the river where the towers caught the last of the sunset, cranes still pierced the dusk. Once, those cranes were his allies. Once, his name had meant that deals would close, loans would be secured, apartments would be delivered with marble counters and children's laughter echoing through sunlit halls. He had been an entrepreneur with a small empire, apartments, a construction company, invoices that stacked into comfortable impossibilities. His daughter's drawings were framed on mahogany desks. His wife sipped espresso from cups that matched the china in his empty kitchen, now sealed by a bank. The fall had not been sudden in memory, but swift in motion. A smiling man in the accounts office, Mauricio Tavares, had been the person Olavo trusted most. He had been the finance director, the one who handled numbers and signatures when Olavo was traveling, the friend who had toasted to future launches and joked about retirement in faraway vineyards. At parties, they'd laughed. In meetings, Mauricio had raked through spreadsheets long after others left. He had been close enough to draft checks in Olavo's name and to crease contracts with paper stamped in the legal firm's seal. The first memory he could not stop replaying was a slow, polite chess game in a glass conference room. Mauricio's voice even, his hands folded, a file slid toward Olavo like a present. "Sign at the bottom," Mauricio had said, and Olavo had done what he always did, trusted the man who managed the treasurer's spreadsheets as a matter of habit. Later, when the bank seals arrived, the notices on the office door, and the legal letters with language that felt like a foreign tongue, Olavo realized those signatures had been used against him. Not only had his accounts been emptied of liquidity, but loans had been restructured into side companies, guarantees forged, lines of credit redirected into entities that belonged to people who had never answered his phone. There had been courtrooms then, and lawyers' whispers, and the slow, corrosive work of reputation unraveling. Investors withdrew, partners kept their distance, and the photographs of his smiling family on the staircase were the kind of private things that become proof of a life you no longer own. Marina left with the children, not in a single dramatic night, but in a string of absences and polite explanations. She packed only what she could carry. And when she looked at him that last time, there was the look of someone who had tried to hold on to a marriage, but could not bear the public humiliation. "I have to protect the kids," she said, and then she closed the door. Months blurred into each other like rain on glass. Olavo spent them learning the mechanics of hunger and the geography of tolerance. Where the soup kitchens were, which subway corners could shelter him from the wind, which shelters accepted him, and which turned him away out of bureaucratic courtesy. He learned the names and stories of those who had become his small, informal family on the street. Sojuan, who sold newspapers but saved twigs for a morning flame. Donna Maria, who braided scarves from plastic bags and insisted on calling him Señor Olavo with a tenderness that embarrassed him. And a library worker, Carmen, who let him use the public computer when the afternoon crowd thinned. They treated him as a man with dignity despite the coat. Most nights, Olavo slept in fits, waking with the same small terror, that someone would come and take the pen drive, that the world he knew would be erased completely by the bureaucrats and the men who now wore his name like a well-placed brand. He whispered his grandmother's old phrases into the damp air sometimes, half superstition and half comfort. She had been a woman of simple sayings, the kind of faith that smelled of baking and clean linen. "Keep the truth close," she used to tell him. He had always thought it literal, something for contracts and ledgers. Now he felt the depth of it, truth as the only currency he had left. In the daytime, he scavenged for certainty. He would go to the library, press his fingers to the pen drive like a pilgrim, and open the files he had managed to save. Emails, a handful of recordings, a scanned copy of a bank transfer that did not make sense. Some files were corrupted, others were plainly dangerous. Replies from Mauricio, drafts with numbers, an email thread that hinted at hidden accounts. He did not know how to prove authenticity. He only knew it was the same voice on the recordings, the same patterns of signatures, the same dates that placed money in places it had no business being. It was a skeleton of proof waiting for someone with experience to lay it on a table and show it for what it was. Olavo did not expect miracles. He had learned that the world did not operate like the stories in his old magazines. But he also had stopped expecting everyone to turn away. Once in the corporate years, small acts of loyalty had been banal. A driver who arrived early, a receptionist who smiled when his name was called. He had always thought of loyalty as predictable, as one of those resources you consumed and expected to be replaced. The betrayal had taught him another truth. Loyalty is rare, and when it is found, it's heavier than money. He found it in the rain, though he did not know it then. They called him Rafael Costa, though he waved off surnames and liked when people called him by the short form. He had been the head of security at Olavo's company, years ago, when the company still had a heart that beat around a boardroom table. He'd been the kind of man who kept a chain and a level head, who knew the layout of the corporate office better than anyone, and whose handshake conveyed more than welcome. It carried a promise. When the takeover happened, Rafael had been pushed out, pointedly, methodically. He had been a thorn in Mauricio's plan, the man who asked questions and kept records of comings and goings. It had been easier for Mauricio to create distance than to explain his choices. Rafael left with nothing, the way men do who do not belong in conversations of boiler suits and bank statements. He took odd jobs, driving armored vans and sometimes doing security for executive families on holiday. He never left the city. People said he had watched from the margins. He had not. He was practical. He had a phone and a network and a stubborn habit of showing up where help might be needed. When he heard whispers about a man living under a bridge who used to be one of the city's builders, he went. When he saw the face in the dim light, he did not say sir or boss. He said Olavo's name and crouched so he could meet his eyes at the same level. Recognition is an awkward thing. It does not always come with speeches. Rafael sat across from him that first night, hands warm from a thermos of coffee, and looked at the thin lines time and disgrace had etched into Olavo's face. "You can't keep it here," he said quietly, gesturing to the pen drive in Olavo's hand. He did not offer pity, he offered a plan. Olavo blinked. The plan felt risky simply because someone was offering one that did not include judgment. "You don't have to," he began, but Rafa stopped him. "I don't leave people who save their crews," Rafael said. He had once stood at the back of Olavo's conference room when the company had celebrated milestones. No applause, only the kind of work-hardened loyalty that kept doors from being kicked down. Not for what they did wrong, but for what they did right. Rafael's eyes were steady, not heroic. He spoke like a man who measured steps. He had contacts, a librarian who would open the back office after hours if asked, an old friend in a newspaper who remembered corruption when it smelled like paper and receipts, and a retired sergeant who still owed Rafael favors. He believed, with the narrow faith of a man who had little time for platitudes, that a careful chain of evidence and the right journalist could reopen conversations and make people listen. Olavo had not expected someone from that world to cross the bridge for him. Most of his old acquaintances were now meetings and calendars and polite disavowals. Rafael's presence was not a deus ex machina. It was a practical offer of elbow grease and social capital. He arranged shelter for the night in a municipal center away from the open river winds. He bought Olavo a small toothbrush, a clean shirt, and sat with him while they went through the files on the pen drive. They opened the drive together at Dona Carmen's library the next day. The library smelled like paper and lemon oil. Carmen was a woman who wore cardigans the way some people wore armor, soft, patient, and always ready to protect the underdog that crossed her threshold. She had been gentle with Olavo from the first time he wandered in wordless. She did not ask the question everyone else wanted to ask. She ushered them to a back terminal, away from the children's reading tables, and locked the door with a kindness that felt like a tiny ceremony. Raphael did not trust cloud services or public computers for the chain of custody reasons he explained in short, plain sentences. He was not a lawyer, but years of watching people lie had taught him the value of documentation. He insisted they make copies, print what they could, and create a clear, readable timeline. Carmen, who had once worked as a court clerk before moving into librarianship, understood the need for legibility. She found the printer jammed at first, then coaxed it into life with the patient determination of someone who had seen worse. Olavo watched as files spilled onto the paper tray. Emails with subject lines that looked innocuous but stitched together formed a fabric of deceit. Scanned receipts that mapped money into shell companies. Audio files with voices that could be placed by anyone who remembered Mauricio's cadence. Each page was a small exhumation of what had been hidden. He let himself breathe as Raphael organized the papers into a packet, a few copies, each marked with date and place. The packet itself felt heavier than the pen drive. It was physics of responsibility. Weight in the hand, weight in the world. For the first time in months, someone other than his own shame suggested he was not alone in the truth. Raphael moved with a peculiar mix of tenderness and tactical competence. He made calls quietly, asked for favors without scripts, arranged a meeting with a journalist he trusted but did not kowtow to the press. His contact was Ana Ribeiro, a reporter whose byline had once embarrassed a politician and whose ethics were as sharp as a file folder. Raphael did not flatter her. He offered her a meeting and a dossier, and she agreed to look. The air between the two men filled with plans that felt dangerously like hope. They rehearsed what to say, what to hold back. They considered the possibility that the files would be dismissed as fabricated, the technique that common enemies used, to shout fake and make the truth sound like a rumor. Raphael's counter was simple: make the story too detailed to ignore. There were dates that could be verified. There were bank transfers with third-party beneficiaries who had names that could be traced. There were voice notes that, with proper forensics, would show pattern and ownership. Forensics would cost money. Raphael had no money, did not pretend otherwise. He had instead a ledger of favors, debts, and favors owed in the margins of relationships. In lunchrooms away from the cameras, he mentioned a retired sergeant, Torres, who owed him for a favor years ago. Torres had a soft spot for honest people and a soft hatred for those who used power to steal. Perhaps Torres could advise without file stamping. Perhaps a journalist's curiosity would stir the police into looking twice. They had to be careful. They had to move when Mauricio least expected it. Olavo listened and sometimes panicked. He had been beaten in a way that felt like erasure. More scary than violence was the quiet wiping of his name from ledgers. The idea of contact with the press sent a current through him. Fear and longing braided together. If the files were true and presented well, Marina might see them, might understand the betrayal outside the fog of legalese. She might come back. Yet he also knew that light could scorch. He had to be patient in a world that expected decisions now. "Why do you care?" he asked Raphael one evening as they sat on a bench near the library, hands warmed by paper cups. The rain had stopped. A city sweep cleaned up the corners, and people began to appear with bags and purpose. "You could have disappeared. You didn't have to find me." Raphael stared out at the river for a moment. "Once you stood at the head of a team and told us not to cut corners," he said. "You fought for workers to get safer scaffolding. You paid health benefits when others said no. I don't do loyalty to bosses. I do loyalty to the men and women who matter. He smiled briefly, and in that smile there was a thread of memory, of men on rooftops, of Olavo walking among them and saying the right things when it counted. Plus, someone taught me it's better to be a nuisance than a coward. He tapped his temple lightly, as if to make the lesson physical. And I don't like seeing someone who built things with their hands sleeping like a shadow. There was a rough tenderness to him that Olavo had not expected. Raphael had the muscles and the patience of a man who had learned how to wait. He was not naive. He knew reputations could be ruined beyond repair, and that some evidence would be shredded or hidden in legal double talk. But he also knew networks. A cleaner at a bank who would glance the other way for a cup of coffee, a clerk who remembered the way Mauricio's handwriting slanted on checks, a journalist who had written about construction fraud before and would look with interest at odd transfers. They moved with small steps like this for weeks. Olavo stopped avoiding the reflection of shop windows. He let himself be cleaned at the municipal center. He spoke to Marina once by phone after months of silence. The conversation was careful, the kind of cautious re-entry that felt like testing the water. Her voice had not lost its edge. She had protected herself and the children. "We have a life now," she said, and Olavo heard not only rejection, but also the way people try to make new houses when the old ones collapse. When Ana Ribeiro agreed to listen, both men felt a jolt that was hope and terror stitched together. She asked for a first meeting in a neutral place, insisted on copies that could be authenticated. She did not promise headlines. She proposed careful verification. Olavo read her conditions and felt them like a bridge with a narrow plank. Raphael was practical. Meet her in the evening, bring the printed dossier, and do not use the company networks. "We can't risk surveillance," he said. "Mauricio has resources." That was the truth. Mauricio had resources both visible and the sort that hid in account statements. He had friends in places that liked money. He was the man who smiled while handing out bonuses that now looked like bribes in hindsight. He was also petty and clever, the sort who restructured names and created paper labyrinths. If caught, he would create a smokescreen and scatter witnesses. He might even try to buy silence. They arranged for Ana to meet in a small cafe off the main avenue, the kind where the light was good for photographs but the crowd distracted easy eavesdroppers. Raphael insisted on a different plan. Ana would hear a summary, take the documents, and then call a friend in the paper to arrange a forensics check. If the checks matched, she would publish. The best press could do was force authorities to reopen investigations. The rest would be the slow arc of the law. On the morning of the meeting, Olavo woke with a panic that woke him like physical pain. The packet he carried felt both heavier and more fragile than the pen drive. He had imagined this moment over and over. The journalist's eyes narrowing, the careful questions, the turning of pages. He had also imagined 1,000 ways the world would not look at him twice. He was not naive. Rejection had become a currency. Yet the possibility of being listened to was a warm current beneath his ribcage. They walked to the cafe as if they were men hiding a relic. Raphael wore a denim jacket, the kind that made him vanish into crowds, and he kept his gaze forward. He had planned the route carefully. Curving alleys and a short detour through a covered market so they would not appear on the cameras that sometimes watched wealth for the thrill of scandal. Olavo's heart beat as if it wanted to climb into his throat. He clutched the dossier like a child clutches a parent at a train station. At the corner near the cafe, a boy selling newspapers looked up and gave Raphael a nod. The boy's gesture was nothing and everything, an acknowledgement of being seen, a small piece of the city's web. The nod reminded Olavo that life was stitched together by countless tiny recognitions. Ana arrived late, polite and sharp, a woman with a notebook and glasses that made her features precise. She listened to the outline Raphael gave. No flamboyant claims, only a clear statement. A man had been framed. Here was a packet of documents, verify them. She took the dossier and then did something that made Olavo feel like both a patient and an accused man. She prepared a list of questions to check next, names to call, accounts to verify. "Can you prove chain of custody?" she asked. It was a phrase Olavo had not expected to matter so much, and yet the world always asked for proof of how proof was handled. Raphael answered calmly. Photocopies, timestamps, 2 witnesses who could corroborate the physical dates. Carmen had written a small note on library letterhead attesting to the time they had printed. Raphael said he could offer a sworn account from the sergeant. Anna folded the paper and looked at Olavo as if expecting him to stand. Olavo did. He told her what he could in a voice that shook like a bridge under wind. He told her of the long meeting where the papers were signed, of evenings he had spent putting projects to bed, of the sudden bank seals, of the quiet little patterns that made no sense until someone with curiosity began to connect dots. He did not ask for pity. He asked for listening. Anna placed her pen down, and for a moment the world narrowed to the 4 of them. Why would Mauricio do this? She asked. The question had bluntness to it, because motives make stories legible to the public. He wanted control, Olavo said. He wanted to build an inner circle without me. He wanted my authority, and he reshaped documents to make it look like I had signed them willingly. The explanation was simple, but cruelty often is. Those who seek power rarely make art of it. They do paperwork and wait for the silence of others. The meeting closed with a promise of caution. Anna would call the next day after preliminary checks. Raphael insisted Olavo stay hidden. Public exposure before verification could lead to vultures or legal attacks. They arranged for Olavo to sleep at a small shelter that night under a different name. Marathon days of patience had begun. They left the cafe walking in different directions. Olavo felt something like oxygen return to his lungs. He had a friend who believed him. He had a journalist's interest. He had a list of steps. For the first time, the future looked neither wholly bleak nor safe, but possible in a dangerous way. Raphael's quiet competence had given shape to a path. Yet even as hope stirred, the city had ears. They were not thinking about him. The city's ears listened for sensation and for profit. A man at a car wash glanced too long. A woman at a florist checked her phone and frowned. The old world that had turned its back on him might not stay unaware of his attempt to be heard. There were people like Mauricio who kept a pulse on people who threatened their designs. They had ways of making evidence evaporate, or of making those who carried it afraid to speak. That night, Olavo lay on a narrow cot in a municipal shelter and whispered something to the dark. His grandmother's phrase again, a small prayer-like sentence that he refused to dress up as doctrine. "Give the truth room to breathe," he murmured. Whether God heard him or fate simply watched, he didn't know. What he knew was that the next morning would bring a call, a meeting, or silence. The dangerous part of hope, he thought, was that it could be used against you if you did not guard it. Raphael would guard it. That was part of his promise. He moved in ways that were both humble and decisive, making calls, arranging safe places, and, when necessary, putting himself between Olavo and prying questions. He was not a soldier of fortune. He was the kind of man who could read a camera lens and guess if it was live. He had learned that protection was patience, and that loyalty sometimes meant refusing to let someone carry their shame alone. Word trickled in slow and careful drips. Anna's first call was a soft one. "There are irregularities," she said. "I'm sending someone to check a name. If this holds, it's a story." For Olavo, the sentence tasted like electricity and acid at once. Raphael nodded, the set of his jaw a map of resolve. "We keep moving forward," he said. "We don't let them set the tempo." The tempo they set was cautious. Copies of files, a tentative phone call to a bank clerk who remembered the handwriting of signatories, a check with someone who had once worked in the escrow department and who would answer small questions for the price of a coffee. Olavo watched as the practical scaffolding of truth was rebuilt. Documents cross-checked, dates verified, names called. It was labor unlike the kind that paid fortunes. It was persistent, ordinary work.
Yet unlike his construction projects of old, this work did not begin with concrete and cranes. It began with patience and people willing to speak. And in those days, the smallest kindnesses meant more than money. Donna Maria brought him stew and refused to take payment. Sale Joao found him a small thermos and set it on the bench next to his paper stack like a relic. Carmen, the librarian, tucked a slip of paper into Olavo's palm. The kind of line a woman who keeps records gives when she believes someone.
On it, she had written simply, "Keep the truth close." A grandmother's saying had become a tangible note, and Olavo kept it folded in his wallet like a seam of hope. The city, however, is a vast thing with many hands. While they gathered the pieces, someone else moved in silence. There was a man in a suit who took an interest in minor details, who had once been a courier for agreements, and who now found odd ways of being present at the right time. He kept his distance, watched a market stall longer than needed, and took note of people's faces. He had friends in places that liked being paid not with money but with favors. The way of man like Mauricio has always been to set traps long before the hunted know they exist. On the morning a reporter called back to say the preliminary checks showed a pattern worthy of full investigation, Olavo felt the floor drop out in a different way. He had prepared himself for silence. He had not prepared for the loud possibility that his name might again be dragged across front pages. Raphael watched him with the steady gaze of someone who had seen exposure end careers and sometimes save them. "We control what we can," he said. "We'll make sure the first word anyone hears is the truth." They did not know yet that at the other end of the city, Mauricio read an early copy of a rumor and smiled in a way that did not include mercy. He would not go quietly into the coming storm. He owned too much of the machinery that moved money to be stopped by a single dossier. He would use what he had, as men of his type always do. Lawyers, shell companies, whispers of bankruptcy, the sort of procedural fog designed to drown an otherwise simple story. But there are times when a brave thing becomes inevitable because too many people are tired of looking away. For Olavo, the sensation was like being taught to walk again. The first steps hurt, the joints remembered old habits, but there was a direction. Raphael gave him a list of things that were practical and small. Keep to a safe route, do not meet alone with anyone connected to the old company, and don't sign anything without a lawyer. "We'll get you a lawyer," Raphael said, as if the words were bricks you could hand someone. The meeting with Anna was arranged, the dossier in place, the reporter's curiosity piqued. And yet, as they walked away from the cafe that day, Raphael's eyes caught a man across the street whose suit was a little too sharp, whose phone was held in a way that did not look casual. He noted the man's license plate in a quick, efficient way. Olavo did not follow the calculation in that moment, only the sudden weight that something could shift. That weight made the breath go shallow and the pen drive feel like a splinter under the skin. They were not finished. They had not yet forced a door open. They had only begun the small acts that make stories: patience, copies, honest people willing to speak. But in a city, beginnings are themselves dangerous.
To be seen moving back toward light is to invite the wind. If this story is stirring something in you, type family in the comments. The next days were a careful choreography. Raphael taught Olavo how to move without making a show, which bus to take when, where to wait, which bench to avoid because of cameras. Olavo learned how to listen for the click of a phone that might indicate a photo. Carmen remained a silent ally, offering a terminal where they could print without drawing attention. Anna's questions became sharper as she looked deeper. Names that suggested shell companies, unexpected beneficiaries, a pattern of transfers that suggested premeditation rather than coincidence. As the reporter's interest grew, so did the danger. Small things began to happen. A bank clerk who would not return a call, a note slipped into a locker saying, "Stop digging," and an anonymous email that accused Olavo of fabricating evidence. The accusations were familiar, reversals that big men used when threatened. Raphael taught Olavo how to hold the work steady, document the threat, save the emails, make the threats themselves part of the pattern. Every attempt to intimidate became potential corroboration of the other side's desperation. One evening, a photograph arrived on Anna's phone, a picture of Olavo taken outside the shelter. The sender was anonymous, but the image had the slight skew of a man who had not planned it to be public. Olavo felt his stomach pinch. He had expected exposure, perhaps in the future, but not like this. He called Marina and tried to explain with a voice that attempted to be calm. She answered, and there was a pause so long that he felt the city lean toward him. "I'm listening," she said finally, in a tone that threaded both caution and curiosity. "Marina," he started, and the name felt like a fragile vessel. He did not ask for forgiveness in that phone call, not yet. He only wanted her to know he was trying to set things right. He told her the truth as he knew it, in small pulses. He did not want her to be the first to know of a journalist. That would be too public. He wanted her to have the dignity of hearing from him before her friends and the gossip columns. She listened and did not promise anything. That, he had learned, was the realistic thing in love. People take their time to rebuild trust. He understood it as humiliation had taught him to. Yet when she asked one simple question, "Are you safe?" something inside him cracked open. "Not completely," he said, "but I have someone with me." He said Raphael's name like a prayer of the practical sort. Marina paused, and he imagined that she pictured a man in a coat, perhaps a memory of the old days. She did not say she would come. She did not say that she would leave. She said only, "Be careful." There are moments when the past reaches for you, not to help, but to pull you back.
A man with a press card and a polite voice called Olavo that same week, asking questions that sounded like curiosity, but that smelled of calculation. He offered sympathy and a cigarette and asked the sorts of questions journalists ask when they are not yet certain to take your side. How did it feel when they closed your accounts? Would you be willing to appear in an interview? Olavo declined. He had been burned by words before. Now he wanted facts. Raphael had taught him to treat cameras like hungry animals that could be either allies or predators. The first public whisper came not from the paper Anna worked for, but from a small online blog that had picked up the rumor from a tipster. It was messy and speculative, and it carried the scent of 100 other stories that sprout in the city's swamp of gossip. The post did not name names, but implied that a man of consequence had been implicated in irregularities and that a disgruntled former executive was stirring trouble. The blog's comment section was cruel and immediate. Olavo felt the old shame flare. He wanted to duck and disappear. He wanted to go back to the serenity of being ignored. But after all this time, he had come to understand that being visible could heal as easily as it could harm. Raphael's presence steadied him. "Let them talk," Rafa said. "We move the facts forward." Facts were the only weapons that did not feel like weapons in his hands. The day Anna's piece finally appeared, tentative, careful, naming very little but outlining a pattern, was an odd mix of relief and adrenaline. It was not a triumphant front-page story. It was a cautious step that invited scrutiny. Yet the city read it. Whispers morphed into questions. Someone who had once been indifferent now looked at the cranes and thought about the scaffolding. A neighbor called the bank to ask for clarification. A clerk who owed a favor remembered a date. The slow muscle of public curiosity flexed. Mauricio noticed. He did not show it with fireworks. He moved as men of his class move. Calls whispered to lawyers, the tightening of belts around operations, the clearing of files that might be inconvenient. He did not, at first, accuse. He planned. That planning is always a signal that a man intends to fight. Olavo watched the movement from a distance, feeling the world tilt toward a moment of motion. He had proof and witnesses and a bodyguard-like friend who had become much more than muscle. Yet the full reclamation of his life was not yet possible. Marina remained cautious. The children's faces existed in frames in his mind, not in his arms. The legal world was a set of slow, grinding machines that took months to process grievances. This was the dangerous place between accusation and resolution, where reputations hang and patience becomes a necessary virtue.
As weeks passed, small victories accumulated. A bank clerk who confirmed a date, a transaction that had a traceable path, a record of a company that had appeared briefly and then dissolved. Each tiny victory was a stitch in a fabric that would eventually be too stiff to ignore. On a humid Thursday evening, when the light slanted across the river and the cranes caught fire in the last of the sun, Raphael and Olavo sat on a bench that faced the skyline. They had been given no guarantees. They had only a journalist's interest and the patience of people who had learned to do their work without applause. Olavo pressed his pen drive in his pocket like a small prayer. Raphael placed a hand on his shoulder, not in patronizing sympathy, but as an affirmation of presence. "We're not finished," Rafa said, "but they can't unsee what we've given them, and they can't take away what you remember. Let the process be loud enough to make them answer." Olavo nodded, understanding the truth of the statement. Justice is often a noisy animal that must be irritated into movement. He thought of the homes he had built in his past life and of the people who had erected them with calloused hands and fierce loyalty. He thought of Marina's last look before she left and of the small face of his daughter drawing suns with too many rays. He thought of the pen drive and how fragile it was, almost laughably small, and how life often hinges on objects no bigger than a thumb. The next move did not come with trumpets. It arrived through phone calls, subpoenas, and a small white envelope with a police insignia that felt oddly ceremonial in Olavo's trembling hands. Anna's reporting had been careful but insistent. She had pushed enough for internal reviewers to look twice, and in that small insistence she had nudged a detective who liked to follow the smell of paperwork. The detective, an inspector named Moretti, who had the kind of patience that only years of paperwork breed, called for a meeting. He wanted to see originals. He wanted to understand how the pen drive had been found and how the copies had been handled. Raphael met him like a man who had rehearsed for this moment without fanfare, with dates, witnesses, and a quiet insistence on rigor. The police did not move overnight. They moved according to procedures that respected the chain of custody and the need for independent verification. That was what made their eventual action credible. First, a forensic lab took custody of the audio files. A neutral technician, summoned by the paper's legal team and the district attorney's office, confirmed patterns in voice cadence and timing that matched Mauricio's known recordings, presentations he had given publicly, a voicemail he had left for an old colleague, a recorded meeting logged in the company archives. It was not a single proof, but a pattern. Signatures compared, file metadata analyzed, timestamps cross-referenced. Where the dossier had been a fragile hope, the forensic reports became a scaffold. At the bank, a nervous clerk who had carried stacks of invoices for years remembered a small quirk in a signature and followed a hunch. He pulled old reconciliations and noticed that a transfer had landed in a company registered under a name that had once been associated with an offshore trustee. The trace was messy and required patient untangling, but when the paper trail met the lab reports, the pattern grew undeniable. Moretti's team worked within the limits of the law. They sought warrants, they interviewed witnesses, and they built a case that would hold up in court. Mauricio noticed the movement. He could not have missed it. And he responded the way men of his kind do, with lawyers who sent letters full of legal threats and with PR people who tried to make the story about process rather than theft. He attempted to muddy the waters, suggesting that Olavo was fabricating evidence in retaliation. He tried to paint Anna's reporting as sensational and questioned the chain of custody for the files. That strategy had destroyed reputations before. But this time, the defense ran into the unglamorous strength of paperwork done right. Notarized copies, independent lab reports, and the testimony of bank staff who had begun to feel the weight of a moral line being crossed. On the day the warrant for Mauricio's office was executed, Olavo watched the newsfeed with a silence that had nothing to do with victory. There was no triumphant smile, only a slow, hollowing return of breath.
Raphael sat beside him, the kind of quiet that does not require words. They had waited for this for months. The images of police officers leaving Mauricio's glass office carrying boxes felt to Olavo like the city rearranging itself to right a wrong it had helped obscure. Raphael had a hand on Olavo's shoulder when the story shifted from rumor to reality. "You did the work," he said simply. "You kept the thing that mattered." The simplicity of the sentence was not sentimental. It was a practical acknowledgement of truth done with its sleeves rolled up. There were hearings and depositions. There were days when Mauricio's lawyers filed motions and tried to force the process into knots. There were journalists who demanded exclusives and pundits who debated whether a man who once had power should be brought low in public. Olavo endured cross-examinations of his character nearly as fierce as those of the evidence itself. He listened as people parsed his motives, and at times the old fear returned. What if a well-placed lie could still twist the story? But the small, patient work of truth, people willing to sign statements, technicians willing to stand by their analyses, the journalist's carefulness, formed a sturdier base than the smoke and mirrors Mauricio used. When the indictment finally came, it read like a ledger of betrayals: embezzlement, false signatures, diversion of funds into shell accounts.
It did not restore what Olavo had lost, but it made the theft legible in a way the world could not easily ignore. The press called it a scandal. Some commentators turned it into spectacle, and others watched with private relief as a man who had been admired in his industry faced consequences. For Olavo, the legal documents were not a feast, but a remedy, necessary and cold, and, at last, proving the arithmetic of fidelity and theft. The reunion with Marina happened in an office that smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. It had been arranged with care, as if time were both fragile and precious. Marina arrived guarded, no dramatic embraces, no sudden collapse. She had built a life in the months away, a life that included scheduling, school runs, and a small apartment with a dinner table that fit the three of them instead of a grander household. She walked into the room, and for a moment both of them simply held space, measuring the distance that absence had carved. "Why now?" she asked, a practical question that held years of hurt with great economy. Olavo told her the truth in the only way he could, slowly, plainly, without pleading. He spoke of the files, of the pen drive, of Raphael and Anna and Carmen and the sergeant who had whispered lines in a way that smelled of old loyalties. He showed her the forensic report with its dry language and the bank statements laid out like a map. He did not ask for immediate absolution. He asked only to be believed enough to listen. Marina listened, and that listening was the beginning. She asked hard questions. Why had Olavo not seen it sooner? How had he signed where he should not have? What had he done when the doubts first surfaced? And Olavo answered with the kind of honesty that had been carved by months of solitude. He explained how trust had once been efficient, how a person's name can be a kind of currency that you accept almost without thought, and how the smallest administrative permission granted in a conference room could be twisted into a weapon. She read the documents, and slowly the facts did their work in her mind. The skepticism in her eyes softened, not because everything was now easy, but because evidence made room for reevaluation. There was no movie moment of speed forgiveness. There were apologies that smelled like humility, and reparations that would take time. Marina was practical. She asked about legal steps, about the children's schooling, about the safety of reuniting. Her questions were not the absence of love. They were its cautious grammar. When Marina agreed to see the children with Olavo present, it was not a triumphant reunion so much as a fragile experiment. His daughter's face, older by months, though still drawing suns with too many rays, studied him with the same curiosity a person has for someone returning from a long, confusing trip. The boy clung to Marina's hand at first, then let it go to accept a small toy Olavo had bribed with a promise of future peanut butter sandwiches. The hug they shared at the door, where Marina kissed him briefly but deliberately, held more weight than any speech.
Forgiveness, Marina would later say, was not an event but a set of decisions toward new trust. She needed to see behavior, not headlines. Outside the courtroom, as accusations turned into testimony and testimony into verdict motions, journalists thronged and opinions shifted like weather. Some neighbors who had once whispered about Olavo's fall now stared at the sight of police cuffing a man whose smile had once been unshockable. The sight of Mauricio in handcuffs flattened a lot of layered complexity into a simpler image, a man held accountable. It did not erase the months of humiliation Olavo had suffered, but it ended a season where his name could be traded like currency in a corrupt market. When the judge's ruling marked a step toward formal accountability, Olavo did not leap into triumph. He stood in the small press courtyard with Raphael at his side and felt something steadier than victory, a responsibility he had not carried for a long time. He had been restored by procedure and by the work of many people: journalists who remembered why truth mattered, bank employees who would not let reputation silence their sense of right, and a policeman who understood that patience in investigation was itself a form of justice. The family's slow return to one another was a project that took months and small intentional acts. School plays attended, dentist visits, overdue bills quietly paid, and the rearrangement of a life around new priorities. Olavo did not return to his old office as if nothing had happened. He returned with a different list in his pocket. The work he had once done to shape skylines now came with the bite of experience. He had watched how paper could be used to hurt and how people could be left to sleep under bridges. The ideas he drafted in late-night conversations with Raphael and Carmen were practical ones: build differently, involve local workers, create training, and never allow bookkeeping to be a black box again. Raphael took a place in that new structure that suited him, not as a celebrity or a man of titles, but as someone who translated loyalty into systems. He became head of security and operations for the new company structure, a role that put him on the board where he could insist on transparency and social oversight. The move was not merely symbolic. Raphael's presence meant checks on accounts, a culture of accountability, and, unexpectedly, a kind of family for him as well. He had never been comfortable with fame, and he never figured out how to explain why he had come back to stand in the rain for a man he had once protected.
Because some people deserve a hand when they fall, he told Olavo once, in a sentence that held both simplicity and a history of shared work. Carmen became a partner in the social mission in a different way. The library where she had kept a back terminal and a kindness became the first community center for training. She organized classes on basic computer skills, helped former shelter residents enroll in vocational certificates, and kept a list of people she thought the company ought to employ. Dona Maria and Seu Juan found steady work. Seu Juan running logistics for local deliveries, Dona Maria teaching basic textile repair that would become a small micro-enterprise for women in the neighborhood. The transition from pity to paychecks was not seamless. It was laborious, with HR learning how to support people who had been excluded for years. But each person who received a steady paycheck felt less like a statistic and more like a restored neighbor. The business itself changed its charter. Olavo used the legal avenues that slowly reopened to him to establish a new entity, a social construction firm with a mandate: affordable housing and inclusive employment. It was not philanthropy in the old billionaire sense, it was a deliberate redesign of what success meant. Contracts were bid with clauses that required hiring from local communities, that required transparent accounting and audits, and that reserved a percentage of profits for community investment. It was, in his view, the most honest way to build, with people, not merely for them. There were skeptics. Many asked whether a man who had just been through scandal could credibly lead such a transformation. There were also journalists who watched the pivot as a PR move. Olavo's answer was in the slow work of projects, a pilot building of 20 units, modest in size but ambitious in purpose. Partners gave small grants. A local foundation provided seed funding for vocational training.
The first housing block provided homes to 30 families. Some had been living in the shelters where Olavo had once slept, others were single parents working odd jobs. The construction site hummed not with the efficient anonymity of the old company, but with a new rhythm. Lunches were shared, mentorship programs organized, and HR practiced more patience than before. 5 years later, the numbers read like a small revolution in a neighborhood. 120 units completed across 3 projects, 60 former street residents trained and employed in construction roles, a community center run by Carmen with a computer lab and a sewing studio that supported micro-entrepreneurship, and a small scholarship fund for children from the housing projects. These were measurable things, not miracles. They were made possible by a chain of events that began in a library and a pen drive and hinged on practical people willing to do patient work. Raphael's role had evolved.
He was no longer simply a protector at the edges. He was director of community safety and relations. He attended board meetings with a vocabulary that combined practical security measures and a careful sense of social responsibility. People in the projects knew him by name and greeted him with nicknames that were part affection, part respect. He kept his denim jacket in a closet now and wore shirts with the company logo. He was given a small office, a place on payroll, and a key role in mentoring young trainees, men and women who had never thought corporate work was a place for them. The reunion between Olavo and Marina settled into a new rhythm that did not erase the past but honored it. They attended counseling meetings together, they consulted on budgetary issues with honesty, they laughed, sometimes with the flat, relieved sound of people who had endured a storm. The children grew accustomed to the presence of Raphael as if he were part of the family's furniture, a steady figure who occasionally appeared at school plays and brought extra sandwiches on project days. Sometimes, at night when the city was quiet, Olavo would stand at the window and thank the memory of his grandmother in a private whisper. He thanked people who had never sought reward. He thanked a librarian who had unlocked a printer, a journalist who had been careful with facts, and a detective who had refused to let procedure be a barrier to truth. There were complications and hard conversations. Not everyone recovered gracefully. Old partners who had distanced themselves never returned, and some relationships ended with an economy of grace that left open wounds. The legal costs and the time consumed in litigation left scars. Olavo's temperament had changed. He had become more cautious and less interested in grand gestures. He had also become more intentional in giving power to others at the company level, transparent accounting being one of them, but also shared governance that required external auditors and stakeholder councils. He understood now that power structures without oversight invite betrayal. The social mission rippled outward. Other small firms in the city noticed a model that combined accountability with public impact. City officials, some of them skeptical and some of them quietly impressed, attended ribbon cuttings and began to ask about contract clauses the new company had pioneered. There were investors who saw both moral and practical value in a model that sought both profit and measurable social return. It was not utopian. There were months when budgets collapsed and times when the politics of urban development made building near a river a bureaucratic labyrinth. But more often than not, the projects met their targets, and lives changed in ways that could be accounted for by attendance records, payrolls, and the slow statistics of children attending school more regularly. For Raphael, life took on a sort of quiet recognition that did not require ceremony. Olavo insisted on honoring him in small, meaningful ways. A seat at the board table, a mention in speeches that never felt like patronage, and a small plaque at the first housing site that read, simply, "For those who stood." Raphael, practical as ever, disliked the fuss, but accepted gestures that signaled belonging. He was, in ordinary terms, rewarded with trust and responsibility. At night, he would sometimes go back to the river bridge, not to return to the past, but to remind himself of how fragile dignity could be. He would run into Sejuan or Dona Maria and ask about their day. The handshake between men who had seen the city's underside was less about thanks and more about a shared covenant to keep working. If there was a moral to the public chapters of Olavo's life, it was that truth is both fragile and durable. It is fragile because it can be buried by paperwork and the quiet elbowing of power. It is durable because it is made up of people who keep records, speak out, and insist on chains of custody. Truth does not always triumph, but it gains traction when ordinary people choose to do tedious, honest work. Olavo found this paradox at the heart of his restoration, that the grand gestures were less important than the discipline of small ones, the careful copying of an email, the willing statement of a clerk, the librarian's patience. On warm evenings when the construction site was still and the last truck had left, Olavo would walk the grounds of the housing projects. He would watch new tenants hanging curtains, a child chasing a stray ball, a woman painting a small balcony bright orange. He would stand at a window and imagine a skyline that meant more than marble counters and glossy brochures. He would sometimes go to the community center and watch a class where Raphael taught safety protocols while Carmen taught computer basics. He would listen to stories of families who could now sleep in beds they owned. These were small, concrete outcomes, a list of homes, a ledger of employees, a set of names who could now say they had been given dignity when the city had once turned away. When asked in interviews what had saved him, Olavo found himself telling the same truth with different words. Not one thing, many people. He emphasized the librarian who printed pages after hours, the journalist who demanded evidence, the detective who followed procedure, the sergeant who offered a quiet affidavit, and the bodyguard who came back because loyalty was a habit that outlived titles. Loyalty is rarely loud, he would say. It's a set of choices. In a small ceremony at the completion of the second housing project, Olavo and Marina stood together to cut a ribbon. Behind them were families who had once been nameless statistics and were now householders. Raphael stood beside Olavo, the person who had refused to let him carry the shame alone. Anna's article that had started the chain of events was framed in a glass case at the community center, a reminder of why journalism matters when done with care. Carmen had a table of handmade scarves for sale, and Seo Juan sold newspapers from a small kiosk that doubled as a bulletin board for local job postings. There was laughter, and there was something quieter, a shared recognition that the work of rebuilding was ongoing. Olavo's voice, when he addressed the crowd, was not triumphant nor preached. It was measured by a gratitude that had been altered by loss. He thanked people who had been patient and people who had been brave in ordinary ways. He spoke of responsibility, of accountability, and of the need to keep systems honest because systems are what protect ordinary lives. The story did not end with the ribbon cutting. There were audits and quarterly reports, and sometimes setbacks that required adjustments. There were nights when Olavo woke and felt the old fear at the edge of his throat, only to find that habit had been replaced by routines that made him check ledgers and attend community meetings. He had been given back a kind of public life, and he tended it like a garden, by weeding, by watering, by listening to the soil. Years later, when children from the projects were asked what they wanted to be, answers ranged from carpenter to teacher, nurse to project manager. The children's ambitions were small and brave, and they carried the quiet potency of a future that looked possible. Olavo sometimes thought of his grandmother's old sayings and smiled. "Keep the truth close," she had said, and he had done just that. He had placed it in a pocket and then, slowly, in the documents of a city that could not ignore it. Raphael and Olavo often met at the same bench by the river at the end of the workday. The city around them had changed, but the river flowed the same. "You did a good thing," Raphael would say, not as a platitude, but as a measure of the miles they had walked together. Olavo would nod, knowing the truth. The good done had cost nights of worry and mornings of small apologies. It had required admitting vulnerability and accepting help. It had required that a man once at the center of power learn to wear patience as a habit. On more private evenings, Olavo kept the pen drive in a small drawer, not as a talisman, but as a reminder of the hinge moment when many small acts combined into a movement toward justice. He would sometimes take it out and rub its edges, remembering the smell of the library, the jammed printer, the warmth of Raphael's coffee. He would not call it a miracle, but a series of human interventions, paper and people and patience that bent a course toward repair.
If you feel moved by this story, share it with someone who needs hope. If it reminds you of the value of plain courage and quiet loyalty, like and subscribe so more stories like this find space to be heard.